Hello. So before getting into the nitty-gritty details of inflationary theories and the types of inflation and the current scenario of the world with regard to the concept of inflation, I just wanted to take a moment to very simply try and explain what is it that inflation is. So by the end of this little explanation, we will have answers to our questions like what is inflation, why is it rising, why are people always so worried about it, and what do interest rates have to do with inflation. So to put it in a very simple manner, inflation is when there is more money in the economy than stuff to spend it on. So if we have to take an example, imagine that you and I, we live in a very small town where all of our essentials and everyday other items we get from one shop. There is just one market in there. So we get our clothes, our phones, our shoes, our electronics, just everything from that shop. But one day, the government comes to our town and they are kind of worried about the economy. So they tell us that, hey, if you want to take a loan, that's cool with us and we're not going to charge a very high interest on it. So go ahead, take loans. So you and I, we go to the bank and we basically take out loans at a very low interest rate. And this encourages us to take out large loans, have a lot of money, and then spend it on the stuff that we like. So basically, there is now a huge pile of cash in our little town's economy, and everyone is feeling pretty rich, right? You and I are now going to our market and getting all of the stuff that we wanted, but earlier could kind of not afford, right? Like I got myself the phone that I wanted, and you got yourself the shoes that you wanted, so on and so forth. And even the shopkeeper, she's pretty thrilled. She's like, nice, right? But she's eventually going to run out of things because everybody has extra money and everybody is buying the things that they want to buy. So the shop owner cannot keep up with the excess demand that has come due to the sudden inflow of cash in the economy. So eventually she is going to raise the prices because the supply is not meeting with the demand. And this raising of prices is right there, that is inflation. So this town, that's all of us. And the market, that is our entire economy. So that's how we understand the concept of inflation. This is exactly what happens. So when there is extra money floating around and people are spending it faster than the businesses can make the stuff, so the industries, they raise their prices. And it is a natural part of the economy, and to a certain level, it is also desirable. But it is good only in small doses because that means that the economy is growing. Now, let's come back to our small town. So the shopkeeper, having had immense success, she opens a factory. She hires people to produce phones because since the supply was low at that time and the demand was high. So to increase the supply, she starts like a huge factory. She employs a lot of people. They're now producing a lot of phones at the price that she was selling them at earlier, right? But now there is no one to buy the phones because people do not have enough money to buy the increased price, the inflated price. So the money runs off, and eventually she's going to have to close the factory. She's going to have to lay off the people that she hired and maybe even shut the business. And when something like this happens in the economy, this is exactly what we call a recession. And subsequent recessions can lead to what we know as an economic depression. These are all terms that we will learn about in our lesson today. So basically, when COVID struck, the governments around the world, they started increasing their spending to keep the economy growing. And for example, the Indian government gave away a lot of free grains. They increased the subsidies. There was an increase in welfare spending, a lowering in the interest rates. So all of this meant that crores of rupees were spent by the government. So people had money to spend and their spending capacity could be retained, and even to a certain extent it increased. The purchasing power of the people increased. But keep in mind, these were times of COVID. And COVID meant that there were supply side restrictions. Yani ki even though during COVID the demand increased because people had money, the supply could not increase. That is why what we are seeing around us right now is a situation where people had a lot of money to spend, but there were supply side restrictions. So immediately the price rose, and now people cannot match that price. So this is why we are seeing inflation around us so often in different countries, because most of these governments, they exercise the policy of increasing their government spending. What do interest rates have to do with all of this, right? So here I'm going to introduce a certain central bank called the Reserve Bank of India, which is our central bank. So Reserve Bank of India can be seen kind of like a puppet master of the economy. So it is not like a regular bank which stores our money and then loans it out at an interest to make a profit. No, the RBI is run by the government to, and it's not, it basically sets the policies that all of the other banks have to follow, and it is not motivated by profit. Rather, their job is to babysit the economy to ensure that it is growing and to make sure that people have jobs, that prices don't fluctuate too much, so that the economy grows at a stable rate. So there is no slowdown and no recession. So remember when I said that the RBI is like the puppet master of the economy? One of the strings that the RBI plays with is the interest rate. So the lower that the interest rates are, the more that the people will borrow, and the more that they will borrow, the more that they will spend. So during COVID, the interest rates were lowered by the government to increase the spending capacity of the people. It was so that the economy could remain stimulated in a time of COVID where there was slowdown. But eventually, due to the lowered interest rate and the high borrowing and high spending, businesses, they raised their prices to meet the new demand. And now the money that people had in their pockets, it became little depreciated. So depreciation is when the money decreases in its value, and that is inflation. So basically, the amount of stuff that I could buy for 500 rupees last year, I can only buy some of that and not all of that for the same amount of money. Yani ki the value of my 500 rupee note, it has decreased due to this little thing that we're going to study about today called inflation. So now that we have covered basically the concept of inflation, we will now look at a little more technical details that are related to the concept of inflation. So in this lesson, we will know about inflation and its types. Yani ki depending on the rate at which inflation is increasing, it is divided into different types of inflation, and we will study about that. Then what we will read about is measures of inflation. Yani ki what are the tools that are used to measure the inflation in the economy, under which we will study about GDP, deflator, WPI, CPI, and so on. Then we will know about the causes of inflation, that what are the reasons that cause a situation like an inflation to occur in the economy. So under which we will study about demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, structural, and so on. Then we will know, remember how I said that inflation to a certain level is desirable in the economy because it leads to growth. So we will know about this optimal level of inflation, which is also known as situation of price stability. And we will know what is this level of optimal inflation in India. And finally, we will wrap up this lesson by learning about government steps to control inflation. That what is it that the government can do to control a situation of inflation. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Inflation and its types. So like we studied, inflation is the persistent rise in the prices of goods and services. So if these prices, they grow steeply, then it is bad for the economy. Why is it bad for the economy? It's because it reduces the purchasing power of people. People are not able to get as much stuff for the amount of money that they're spending. It reduces the savings, it hampers the investment, and so on. So steep inflation, it leads to depreciation of currency. And when currency depreciates, it makes imports, yani ki getting stuff from abroad, costlier, which further increases inflation. So there's a vicious cycle. Macroeconomic stability, yani ki the stability of the entire economy, it depends on the rate of inflation. If inflation rates are within control, then the economy is growing. Otherwise, it may become unstable and unsustainable. So going forward, we will look at the types of inflation. So like I said, at the rate at which inflation is growing, it is divided into several types. The first type that we will study about is creeping inflation. So what is creeping inflation? Creeping inflation is actually something that is desirable in the economy. It is the rate of general price increase up to 4% a year. And this is seen as positive growth. So it is largely positive from a systematic perspective, as it shows that there is growth in the economy. This is why it is called price stability. Price stability is a concept that we will come towards at the end of the lesson, but creeping inflation is in general desirable. Creeping inflation stops a situation like deflation to occur. So deflation is associated with the process of recession in the economy where the prices go down. So as long as there is creeping inflation in the economy, deflation cannot occur. This is why creeping inflation is considered good for the economy, as producers make reasonable profits along with being willing to make investments. So the economy, it keeps growing. Trotting inflation. Trotting inflation is when creeping. Trotting inflation is basically the next step to creeping inflation. Trotting inflation is when creeping inflation increases. And if it gets aggravated, yani ki if trotting inflation becomes worse, then trotting inflation can develop into what we know as galloping inflation. So galloping inflation is a very, very tricky concept. Galloping inflation is inflation at the rate of 8 to 10% a year, which is quite a lot. If galloping inflation is not controlled by correct government measures, then galloping inflation can lead to runaway inflation, which in turn can lead to what we know as the dreadful situation of hyperinflation. So, what is hyperinflation? Hyperinflation is when the prices rise beyond control. It is the result of a fiscal policy that borrows and spends foreign currency in excess of what it can repay. So basically, this is the situation that we are seeing in Sri Lanka right now. It is hit by the worst ever economic crisis that it has ever faced, and hyperinflation levels over there are about 54.6% a month. So hyperinflation is when there's a monthly inflation rate of 20 to 30% or more. It completely destroys the economy. We will know more about the Sri Lanka situation in the next lesson, but this is all about hyperinflation. Then we come to the last stage of inflation, which is monetary collapse. Monetary collapse is when money loses its value and either barter, which is the exchange of goods and services without money, becomes the norm, or a foreign currency may replace the actual currency as the medium of exchange. So this is the ultimate result of hyperinflation. This is what it can lead to. So the types of inflation that we discussed are creeping inflation, trotting inflation, galloping inflation, hyperinflation, and monetary collapse. Moving on, now we will look at the measures of inflation. Measures of inflation are, सबसे पहले तो before we discuss the concept of GDP deflator, we need to know what GDP is. I will discuss it briefly. We will know about a concept known as nominal GDP, and then we will know about a concept known as real GDP. It is only when we know about these three concepts that we will come to GDP deflator. So what is GDP? GDP is the gross domestic product. And the gross domestic product is the metric that calculates the total value of the goods and the services that are produced in a country in a specified time. So GDP is calculated usually on a yearly and a quarterly basis. And it is a judge for a country's growth rate and also its economic size. And a GDP is used by the government, by the banks, by the businesses to make economic decisions. So nominal GDP क्या होता है? Nominal GDP is GDP that is calculated using the current market prices. And so all of the changes in the market ka price, including या फिर due to inflation or due to deflation, all of it is reflected in the nominal GDP because it is based on current prices, right? Then we have real GDP. So real GDP, as opposed to nominal GDP, it is an inflation adjusted calculation. So the GDP deflator, So real GDP is inflation adjusted. So what is nominal GDP? Nominal GDP is the goods and services produced by an economy in a given year at current prices, and real GDP is goods and services produced during the base year. Base year is the year that the government decides that there was normal production, there was not too much inflation, so they use it as a base for calculating, for comparing the current year prices to that. So a GDP deflator is basically nominal GDP divided by real GDP into 100. So this value is known as the GDP deflator. So by using the GDP deflator, this is a tool that we can use to measure how much inflation there is in the economy. Now, the second tool that it is a very comprehensive measure as well. So this is the most commonly used. Since it is very comprehensive. The second measure that we use to calculate inflation in the economy is cost of living index. So cost of living index is a certain standard of living is required for a specific, a certain standard of living is set, and a specific set of goods and services, that is a basket of goods and services, is defined and it is tracked. Unka prices are tracked. So the cost of these goods and services is tracked to ensure that the predefined standard of living is able to be maintained or not. So cost of living is a basket of goods and services are defined and tracked for price changes, and using this change in the basket of goods, the price change in the basket of goods, we can tell how much inflation there is in the economy. Moving forward, we have the concept of the wholesale price index. So what is it? What is the wholesale price index? So wholesale, as we know, it is the sale of goods in bulk. Retailers buy from wholesale markets and they sell it to consumers. There even may be a whole chain of retailers before the product reaches the consumers. So they buy it from wholesale. So wholesale price index, it tracks the price changes at the wholesale level. It is also a very comprehensive measure because it includes stuff like logistics, margins, transportation costs, all of that is included. So wholesale price index, it tracks the price changes at the wholesale level. Now we have consumer price index, what we know as the CPI. Consumer price index, it measures the changes in prices that are paid by the consumer at the retail level. So this is what you and I pay, right? So consumer price index, it measures the changes in price paid by the consumer at the retail level. So this can either be for the whole economy or it can be specific to a group. For example, in India, we have CPI for industrial workers that is calculated, right? So this is an example also that is used. It is an example of a tool that is used to measure inflation. How do we measure inflation in the economy? We measure it by using the GDP deflator. We use it by cost of living index. We use it by the wholesale price index. We use it by consumer price index. There's also the producers purchasing power index, PPI. So all of these are tools that we use to measure inflation in the economy. Then we will now read about the causes of inflation. That what are the causes that lead to inflation in an economy? सबसे पहले तो we have demand pull inflation. Demand pull inflation is rising demand in the economy that pushes the prices. This is basically what I explained in the video, that demand itni increase ho jati hai that price increases by default. So demand pull inflation can be caused due to many reasons. For example, growth in the economy, so income also increases. If the income of people increases, their purchasing power increases. Their purchasing power increases, so demand for the goods it increases. उसके बाद monetary easing, for example, interest rates get lower, so people take loans, their purchasing power increases. All of this creates more demand in the economy. Even welfare schemes like Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So all of that, it gives people money to spend, which in turn increases demand for certain goods. So all of this kind of inflation that is caused by demand, it is known as demand pull inflation. Then we have what we know as cost push inflation. So what is cost push inflation? Cost push inflation is when the inputs that go into the production, they cost more. उनका प्राइस राइज हो जाता है. So this inflation results in what we know as cost push inflation. For example, if food grain that is produced, if the food grain production, rice ka production, it falls due to bad monsoon, then everything that is used in rice, यानी कि rice का आटा मान लो, stuff like that, so unka bhi price increase ho jayega. But this is not due to the demand. This is because the input that goes into making rice flour, that has increased because the rice ka price has increased due to certain barriers. So this kind of inflation is known as cost push inflation, where the inputs that go into the production, they start costing more, and because of that the price of the product rises. Then we have structural inflation. स्ट्रक्चरल इन्फ्लेशन क्या होता है? स्ट्रक्चरल इन्फ्लेशन इज अ परसिस्टेंट काइंड, यानी कि हर इकोनॉमी में किसी ना किसी तरह का स्ट्रक्चरल इन्फ्लेशन हमेशा रहेगा. So that is what it means कि it is a persistent type of inflation, and it may be due to a variety of factors. For example, मानो there is a deficiency in certain condition in the economy. For example, a backward agricultural sector. So the agricultural sector, it is not very technologically adept. So it is not able to meet the demand of food grains. So this is a structural barrier that is causing the prices of the food to rise. It is not an actual barrier, it is a structural barrier. For example, also what we can take is that there is not enough storage facility. For example, the prices of fish so the fishes are stored in cold storage, right? So the prices of fish in the market, they rise. It's because there is not enough cold storage facilities. So this creates an artificial kind of inflation in the rise of fish, because this is a structural barrier. So things like this, these are persistent. It may be caused due to a variety of reasons, because of deficiency of certain kind. So this is structural inflation. And there are also other kinds of inflation. For example, hoarding. Hoarding is when hoarding is accumulation of huge quantities of goods that lead to inflation. For example, hoarding of onions and then releasing them at a time when there's a scarcity for them in the market, so you can increase the price. So this is also artificial, but this is at the end of the day inflation. Then there is speculation. There is imported inflation. Imported inflation yani ki basically when a country is dependent on certain other country for the import of certain goods, and that good sees an international price rise, then that also causes our price to increase. For example, crude oil ka price increasing is due to imported inflation. It's because crude oil ka price is rising internationally. So it also causes crude oil for us to be inflated. This is due to international imported inflation. Now, optimal inflation. What is it that we mean by optimal inflation? So optimal inflation is the question of how much inflation will be good for the economy in terms of growth, welfare and stability. And in India, it is settled through the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement. So price stability hoti kya hai? Price stability, according to the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement, it is inflation rate is fixed at 4% plus or minus 2% on a medium term basis. So basically, the RBI and the Government of India, they have signed this Monetary Policy Framework Agreement, and the objective of this agreement is to maintain price stability while keeping in mind the objective of growth and contain consumer price inflation within 4% with a band of 2%. So what does this do? This helps the public to have clear expectations of prices for the future and behave predictably. It won't lead to speculation, it won't lead to hoarding. If the public have a clear frame of mind of the target inflation of the government, it won't lead to hoarding, it won't lead to panic buying. So basically, clear guidance, it prevents panic buying and thus curbs inflation. And inflation can, price stability, inflation like this, when it is guided, it can be a positive territory that benefits both producers and consumers alike. So this level of inflation is considered optimal from growth, stability, fiscal consolidation, foreign trade, and welfare perspectives, this is the optimal level of inflation that the RBI and the government of India have decided. That is 4% per year with a bandwidth of 2% plus or minus. Right? So, this is optimal inflation in our country. Government steps to control the inflation. So, what does the government do to control inflation or deflation for that matter? So, fiscal measures that the government can take is to adjust import duties on food items. Yani ki duty import ki like badha do. If there is too much inflation and people are still like buying, then you can adjust the import duties. You can adjust the subsidies on food. If there is inflation in the economy, you can decrease the subsidies. If there is deflation, you can increase the subsidies, and so on and so forth. You can stimulate the economic growth. Then adjust the indirect taxes. Basically, GST adjustments ke through also government can control inflation. Then there are administrative measures such as dehoarding. So, for example, in 2014, the government of India added potatoes and onions to the Essential Commodities Act. They did it to prevent hoarding of these essential vegetables, so that their price does not rise beyond a point in the market and it's not inflated. So these are all administrative measures that the government takes to control inflation. Jan Aushadhi shops, they always provide medicines at a controlled minimal rate. Price stabilization fund scheme is also there for the same purpose. Then we have other measures that the government can take, like zero import duty on pulses and onions. So pulses and onions pay even if they're being imported. The import duty is not added to their price, so as to control the price level of these essential items. Then banning on export of pulses. Yani ki if there's a shortage of pulses in our country and we are exporting it, so obviously the supply of pulses is already limited and the demand is so much, so the price will rise. So if the government bans the export of pulses for some time, then locally our levels of inflation for pulses would be controlled. Similarly, empowering the states and UTs to impose stock limits. The states and the UTs can now add certain items to their Essential Commodities Act and thus control the price of these items so that it does not go beyond a certain level and our inflation stays within the optimal target. So that was about inflation. There are a lot of other things that we can discuss in the next lesson, but thank you.